This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Ecuador's young president, Daniel Noboa, is engaged in a dramatic battle with drug gangs, trying to restore government control after the violence of recent weeks. On today's podcast, an overview of the America's latest front in the battle against organized crime.
I'm optimistic because Ecuador really needed a government able to recognize that this is not a small crisis, a security crisis, that this is not about you getting robbed in the streets. This is a conflict. If you do not act, this could evolve into a civil war. That's what I believe.
We all saw the terrifying images out of Ecuador in early January. The takeover of the television station, the kidnapping of police, the deserted streets of the country's business capital, Guayaquil. As drug gangs lashed out at the country's new president, Daniel Noboa, essentially trying to intimidate him and his government and show they, not the elected authorities, were in charge of the country. This story, justifiably, got attention all over Latin America and indeed the world, where so many countries are dealing with the threat of organized crime groups and rising violence. It's clear that Ecuador is a critical front in that broader battle. Well, several weeks have now passed, and President Noboa is trying to strike back, exert central authority, and stop the country's slide toward potentially becoming a narco state. There's been some good news. One poll shows President Noboa has support from 80% of the population. He also has backing from the business community, as well as the Biden administration, which sent several top officials to Ecuador last week. Today on the podcast, we want to ask the question, can Ecuador and President Noboa succeed? Can this 36-year-old son of one of Ecuador's wealthiest families face up to the threat posed by drug gangs, who have used the vast sums at their disposal to corrupt numerous government institutions? What does Ecuador need in terms of money and international support in order to succeed? How is the political landscape likely to evolve in coming months, given the country's historic fragmentation? And remembering that Noboa is president only because his predecessor was impeached last year, which means, in turn, that Noboa's presidency only lasts another 16 months or so. So yes, it's complicated. But we have a great guest. Maria Teresa Escobar is a journalist based in Quito. Originally from Colombia, she has lived in and covered Ecuador for 18 years and sees things through an economic as well as a political lens. Maria Teresa, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
So clearly the initial shock from this spasm of violence that we saw in January has passed. What is the mood now in Ecuador, and how does it compare to the atmosphere on the day that we saw all this mayhem?
Well, people remain somehow optimistic after this huge shock because they perceive that Daniel Noboa's government is taking some action against these criminal groups because for the first time, at last, a government recognizes that this is not an insecurity crisis, but an internal and very violent conflict. But at the same time, you can see that Ecuadorians are deeply worried. They fear they could lose their country. As you know, Ecuador has been known as a sort of an island of peace or a peace island compared to their neighbors, which are Colombia and Peru. I believe that this island of peace is a myth. It was a myth. And it was broken in January by the brutality and the unprecedented violence from the organized criminal gang.
You mentioned President Noboa and how he seems to have strong support. It may be easy to forget how young he is. He's just 36 years old. And the fact that this all happened during his initial weeks on the job. As a veteran observer of Ecuadorian politics, what can you tell us about how this young politician is handling this crisis?
He's young. Some people like to compare him to Bukele.
Do you think that comparison is valid?
Somehow, yes. And that worries me a lot because I do not believe that Bukele is taking the right steps in the conflict. And Noboa is a democratic leader. He's different in that way. But we have seen some images that remind me to El Salvador. We have seen at least 1,000 young people arrested. And there are some videos in social media of security forces kicking some of these young people. We have seen images in jails where prisoners are brought to their knees and singing national anthem. So that raises the question of the human rights amid the conflict.
Maria Teresa, at least at the beginning of this crisis, former President Rafael Correa, who remains the leader of the opposition in Ecuador and is extremely influential, a leader of the left, came out with a statement in support of what President Noboa was doing. Can you talk to us about how his position has evolved since then?
In January 9, when Noboa declared a nationwide state of emergency, every political leader in the country rushed to express his or her support to Noboa and to this war. Then it came the big question, which is how the country is going to pay for this war. This sort of war is very costly, long-term conflict. So Noboa has proposed to raise taxes, a specific tax on goods and services known as VAT. There is when the consensus broke because Revolución Ciudadana, which is Rafael Correa's political party, and the Social Christian Party, which is a right-wing party with an important weight in Congress, they oppose tax raising. They have their minds put on the next presidential election in 2025, and raising taxes is very unpopular and very undesirable, then you will have a presidential election within a year.
It's a very complicated political situation, but let's get into what you just mentioned, which is the economy. Wow, very difficult. The fiscal deficit last year in Ecuador was almost 5% of GDP. Government revenues fell 10% in 2023, before all this happened. Ecuador has big foreign debt, and in years past was a serial defaulter, which means that, in effect, its ability to take credit from capital markets is limited. Now, the Noboa government has sent the finance minister to Washington to undertake talks with multilateral lenders, refinancing some of that debt. We've been talking about security, but the government needs money to fight these battles. How do you see the health of Ecuador's economy evolving now?
Ecuador has this large fiscal deficit. Its revenue sources are shrinking. So there is really no money to finance this war unless you raise taxes. The United States and the European Union have expressed their support to Ecuador in this situation and are willing to cooperate. And there are talks, but there is no money coming from them. There will be a cooperation like sharing intelligence information, like training Ecuador armed forces in this sort of conflict. It will be an assistance to the judicial system. but there is no money. There is no Plan Colombia in place.
That's in reference to a partnership between the U.S. and Colombia, which ran in the late 90s and 2000s and involved U.S. investments of about $10 billion. But, that was only 5% of the total cost of Colombia's security initiative. The rest, the other 95%, was paid by Colombian taxpayers.
Ecuadorian taxpayers are overburdened. They are paying lots and lots of taxes right now, and the economy is not going good. And there is no money available for this war from multilateral organisms or banks. So Ecuador will have to pay for this war alone.
It's very interesting, this comparison with Colombia. One of the most important things that happened was early in Alvaro Uribe's presidency, he was able to convince the Colombian economic elite to pay a one-time security tax of 1.2% of their liquid net assets in order to fund the security expansion that Colombia did during those years. And it yielded about $800 million, which is about $1.3 billion today. It's a lot of money. I have wondered if something similar might be in the cards in Ecuador. But then I was also surprised to see that the tax load in Ecuador, as you're saying, is relatively high. Raising the question of whether there's any political will to take taxes even higher. I mean, how do you break this puzzle?
Look, when President Uribe convinced the Colombian political elite and economic elite that there was a need to pay this tax on war, Colombia had been through like 60 years of conflict with the guerrillas and some 20 to 30 years with conflict with drug cartels. So the country was exhausted. People were more than willing to pay, which is not the case in Ecuador. Ecuadorians, like people, business owners, they don't have any idea of how costly and how long this war will be. No country has won so far the war on drugs.
Look, no country has won this war. That is unquestionably true. But as you know, there are countries like Colombia where life is considerably safer, measurably safer than it was 25 years ago. Complicated in the case of Colombia because there's been a bit of backsliding over the last couple of years, but certainly if you ask a Colombian and say 2018 to compare the way things were in 1989, they would tell you it seemed like a different, much safer country. One more question on this line of thinking. You started this program today by telling me that Ecuadorians were united and that there was an awareness of the risk that the country might be lost to organized crime and effectively become a narco state. That's not the word you used, but that's one possible outcome here. And that made me feel optimistic about where things are headed. And now I feel like I'm hearing a more pessimistic picture. Is it not possible that Ecuador is now having the moment, the epiphany that the Colombians had in the late 90s and early 2000s, where the country says enough and things start to move back in that more positive direction? And it may take, as you put it, years, but at least it will start moving in a positive way. What do you think?
I really hope so. But when you see these agreements over the tax rates needed in order to finance the war, then you perceive that maybe this society is not ready, is not fully conscious of the cost of the conflict. The structural reforms needed in order to strengthen institutions.
And I want to talk about another aspect of that institutional fight, which is the situation in prisons. This is absolutely key to understanding the crisis in Ecuador so far. It was the escape of the gang leader known as Vito that set off this crisis because he escaped from the prison system. The Noboa government declared a state of emergency. The gangs then felt the need to lash out and exert their authority, and that's how we ended up with these dramatic scenes in the street and this new stage of the crisis that we're talking about. Now, there's mounting evidence that the prison system is deeply compromised, that you have officials from the bottom up all the way to the top that are in the pockets of the drug cartels. What progress have we seen, if any, in the last couple of weeks in terms of cleaning up not only this institution, but others in the Ecuadorian power structure that are compromised by the drug gangs?
According to the Ecuadorian Organized Crime Observatory, which is a local think tank, very serious and very prestigious, the strongest criminal groups are already working to forge an alliance to fight back government efforts to tackle organized crime. And they are working in this alliance from jail. In the jail system, it's very corrupt and has been run by the inmates mostly so far, to the point that nobody knows exactly when Fito escaped from jail, from his cell. Some people say it was as early as December. And he walked out the door. He was helped by officials in the prison system and by guards. So there is corruption and there is room to improve that a lot. We have seen some progress. The army is now helping police in taking control of jails. The army and the police are seizing everything from cell phones to shotguns to ammunition. Inmates are hiding in jails. I think that there will be needed a broader effort to clean up the SNI, which is the institution that governs prisons in Ecuador.
We'll be back with more, including the help that President Noboa is getting or not getting from his neighbors after a short break.
The America Society Art Gallery is currently showing the second part of El Dorado, Myths of Gold, a group exhibition exploring the legend of El Dorado as a foundational myth of the Americas. Art at America Society is the longest-standing space in the U.S. dedicated to exhibiting and promoting art from Latin America and the Caribbean. El Dorado Myths of Gold will be on view in New York until May 18, 2024.
Another big part of the question here is Ecuador's neighbors and other countries in South America. I have heard again and again in conversations over the last year, really, from officials in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Peru. I mean, everyone talks about the need to do more in terms of regional collaboration on security, intelligence sharing, and so on. But you also have this other problem of political polarization that ends up meaning that sometimes leaders on the left don't really trust leaders on the right. The opposite, of course, is also true. What have you seen so far from Ecuador's neighbors in particular? You know, Colombia is particularly key because so much of what's happening here is cocaine that's being produced in Colombia and then shipped out through Ecuadorian ports. Have there been any signs of increased cooperation from Colombia's President Gustavo Petro and Ecuador's other regional peers?
Colombia has offered support. President Noboa surprisingly answered this support offer by telling President Petro to allow Ecuador to extradite Colombian criminals in jails in Ecuador, which are like 2,000 people, go back to Colombia. And Colombia cannot receive these inmates because there is a law in Colombia where in order to repatriate an inmate from another country, a Colombian inmate, there must be a request, a formal request from every inmate to Colombia's Justice Department, and there will be an individual process. President Noboa has no time for this process, so he wants to put these Colombian inmates, which are now in Ecuadorian jails, over the frontier between the two countries. I see tension there. On the other hand, President Petro has a different approach to the war on drugs. He has said that Colombian peasants and poor people and young people with no opportunities should not be paying the price for this war, and they are no criminals. And Petro is trying to somehow find he believes in this paz total policy, which means making peace, negotiating and making peace with every single criminal and group in conflict with the Colombian state. Ecuador is in another moment. In order to control the situation, Ecuador needs to fight these criminal gangs. They are very strong right now, so you cannot talk about the truce or peace negotiation with them. First, you have to clap down on them, and then you may negotiate or talk with them. Colombia is in a very different moment right now. You see these huge cartels like the Cali cartel and the Medellin cartel no longer exist. And you see that Colombia has regained control of its territory, and the state is very strong, which is not the Ecuadorian case right now.
You referenced earlier the fact that the war on drugs has never been won by any country. And I have written lately for America's Quarterly about how several countries, including Mexico and perhaps Colombia as well, seem to be quietly backing off of their drug enforcement efforts. This seemed to have been the strategy used by former President Correa when he was in office, to not confront these drug gangs, to seek some kind of accommodation. And that was a period when, there were trade-offs. The homicide rate in Ecuador was much lower then than it is now. On the other hand, it was arguably the prelude of today's crisis because the cartels were able to grow their businesses, penetrate some of Ecuador's key institutions, including the courts. Is anyone in Ecuador right now, either publicly or privately, advocating a return to an approach more like the one that Correa employed, which is something less than full confrontation with these cartels?
Yes, there are voices talking about truce, talking about that this is not our war. This is a war of rich countries having addiction problems with their population. But in my personal opinion, these truces, these so-called truces, are not sustainable because criminal organizations have business and they have differences between them. They will not go to the judge or they will not go to an arbitration tribunal in order to solve these conflicts, these business conflicts. They will resort on violence. In the middle of these conflicts, very violent conflicts, is the civil population. Sooner or later, the war will start again, and the state will be challenged again by this violence.
Maria Teresa, as we look ahead, President Noboa has placed a lot of importance on a referendum taking place on March 10th, where he will ask Ecuadorians to vote on a series of measures, including authorizing extraditions to the United States. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is in that referendum? What are the most important points? And what your current feeling is regarding the likelihood that these measures will be approved by the Ecuadorian population?
I see the most important measures proposed in this referendum are three. First, it is a reform on the country's anti-criminal code, anti-criminal law. It will increase the years in prison that the criminal will serve in prison for terrorism, for kidnapping, for drug trafficking. The other one is extradition. Criminals really fear extradition, especially to the United States. And the other one important point in this referendum is Ecuador has no explicit processes and laws to seize illegal money coming from criminal activities, profits coming from legal activities, and to seize houses or any kind of goods purchased as a result of these criminal activities. I believe that the population will support Noboa's referendum.
As we approach the end of this conversation and we think about the next couple of months, what do you think is the most important factor to watch for people who are trying to figure out whether President Noboa is succeeding or not, and whether the country as a whole is headed in the right direction?
I'll say that it is Congress, or the National Assembly, as it is called in Ecuador. I will watch closely the discussions over this tax issue, how the political forces align regarding the necessity to find resources to finance the war on organized crime. And I'll be very, very watchful of the economic indicators in Ecuador, like a fiscal deficit and debt payments, because I am somehow optimistic, but I fear a combination of these two crises, having a conflict and having an economic crisis at a time when the businesses really suffering the impact of the insecurity. A combination of those two crises could be really, really, really bad for the country.
And yet you said earlier in this conversation that you used the word optimistic to describe yourself. So can you talk just a little more about that and why you feel that way?
Yes, I'm optimistic because Ecuador really needed a government able to recognize that this is not a small crisis, a security crisis, that this is not about you getting robbed in the streets. That's a security crisis. This is a conflict. If you do not act, this could evolve into a civil war. That's what I believe. What you have here in the balance is not only the possibility of living your life at peace. You can also lose the economy in a conflict like this. But that's a real threat. And Ecuador lived, at the end of the 90s, Ecuador was faced to a similar situation. Ecuador was in a war with Peru over the border, and there was an economic crisis. And then President Mawad at the time focused on ending the war with Peru and on a peace treaty, which was very good, but forgot about the economy. And the result was a huge crisis that led this country to dollarization in a very, very traumatic process. It won't be the first time. So President Noboa must pay close attention to the economy.
All right. Well, on that note, Maria Teresa, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.